If anybody knows where to get like extra small work gloves, shop gloves, let me know, because like I struggle all the time with way too much material on my fingertips. I really need gloves that fit me. Man, these gloves! I will be right back. Not we, just me. See, it's partially started already and I haven't had to use any tool. Holy crap. Okay, I've got an itchy nose. You know what, I don't even need to explain that. To move this all over a minute. Okay. Do not put that in the video. Make everything slimy. Okay. Pain in the butt, I tell ya. Paper needs to go. Man, I look like a slob today. I don't even care. It's Sunday. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Alright guys, so in this video I'm going to be putting back together my transmission after waiting forever, it seemed, for parts. They finally all showed up and now I can actually put this thing back together. So I've just got my main shaft and the vise here because that's the first thing that needs to be assembled, and it needs to be assembled before it can go into the gear case. So I'm just going to put this together first. I've just got it clamped in aluminum jaws just to protect the main shaft, and I can just hold it steady then when I do up the nut and everything else. So the first thing to go on is the gear cluster, and that just lines up with these splines here. I'm going to grease it just because it doesn't tell you to in the manual or anything like that, but I'm going to. And it doesn't actually spin on the main shaft, it's fixed to it, so it'll spin with the main shaft. And then the sealed ball bearing and the ball bearing carrier go in next, and they just get pressed together. Like, they're not a super tight fit, but they're a little bit of a press fit, and I'm also going to just grease that just to help with getting that in there. Not too much grease, just like a light film. And then the ball bearing should just fit right in. And my ball bearing that I took out of there, this shield was all chewed up, so you just want to make sure that's going in there straight. Nice and straight. I'm just going to tap that on there a little bit. Another thing to keep in mind too is that the lettering on the bearing goes to the outside of the carrier. All right, and then once it is in the carrier, then it goes on the main shaft, and the bearing is actually like a press fit on the shaft itself. You want to just get it lined up, make sure that it's on there straight. So I've actually got a nice piece of machined pipe that I'm going to use for that. Making sure that it stays straight. And it's got to go down past the threads for the nut. Just a little bit further. So the next thing to go on is my washer with the locking tabs. But you don't want to wreck the shield on the ball bearing though. The ball bearing I took out of here, the shield was all chewed up, probably from someone like jamming a screwdriver in there trying to get the tabs on this washer up. So I'm just going to bend them all up just a tiny bit, just so that there's enough space for me to get a screwdriver in there later. And then it also has these 3 little tabs on the back of it, and those line up with the splines in the main shaft. Just like that. And then the nut goes on with this beveled edge to the top. Make sure the washer doesn't move. Okay. Got that ready to do up. There we go. Alright, so now just bend up one of my tabs here. Being careful of the shield. Is that just to finish it off? There we go. Man, that looks great. Love it when the tabs bend up onto the nut perfectly. Okay, that's it for the main shaft. So next thing I'm gonna have to do is press my 4th gear or my main drive gear bearing into the case, and then I can put all the other gears and the main shaft all into the case, and that's half the job done. So I'm just gonna get ready to do the next step, and then we will be right back. So I'm all set up to press my main drive bearing into the case here, and I've already got it partially started. It's not too hard of a press, but in some cases, if it is a really hard press, you may have to heat your case up to get the bearing in there. The manual will talk about all of that stuff if it is something you have to do, but in my case, I'm not gonna have to actually use any heat, so that's good with me because I've already got some grease and stuff in certain parts on here, and I don't want to have to clean it again just to be able to put it in the oven. But I'm going to show you guys what I actually am using to get this bearing in the case, because the case doesn't fit in my press. I've got a small arbor press and my case is too big to fit in there. So what I'm using is actually a bit of a redneck setup, but I know you guys like my redneck hillbilly ingenuity or whatever you want to call it. I don't know, maybe it's just smart. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, if it works, it works, and if it gets the job done, then great, right? So now what I'm going to use here is I actually got a piece of ready rod. I've got a stack of washers here that's just held in place with a couple nuts, so it's just done up tight so that nothing moves. And then I've got a bigger washer here, and this bigger washer is actually big enough to cover this hole on the inside and the outside of the case, but on the inside of the case. So this washer is actually big enough to cover the hole there. And then I'm going to position this whole thing inside of the case like this, with the washer just covering that hole that the bearing is actually sitting inside of. And then on the outside, over top of the bearing, I'm going to be putting this washer that is just a little bit bigger than the bearing but still fits inside of this hole, because I want the bearing pressed in there but only far enough that it actually lines up with the outside of the case. I don't want to push it in there further than that. So I'm going to use that washer on top of the bearing, and then I've got this washer that's just a little bit smaller. It's got a bit of a smaller hole in it, and that's just to help me keep everything centered with the ready rod. And now I'm just going to start doing up the nut, and hopefully it pulls everything tight like I'm planning it will. Okay, let's take a look at that bearing. Bearing's in there, that's good. Well, that little washer sandwich works pretty good, if I have to say so myself. I might even throw this in the tool drawer. So the next step is actually getting the main shaft into the case and assembling the rest of the components onto the main shaft. So that is what I'm going to do next. Okay guys, so it's a couple weeks later, and that is because I started putting back together my main shaft assembly, and then I was taking a closer look at my countershaft assembly, and I realized that there was some parts that I had neglected to check that I actually needed to replace. So I ended up having to order a second gear bushing as well as a new countershaft itself, and it takes a couple weeks for those V-twin orders to show up from the States. So I was on a bit of a hold up again with this transmission. I swear this is like the longest transmission rebuild ever in probably the history of anyone. But it's my first one, so I'm not beating myself up too much. By the time I do another one, I should know all of this and it should go a whole lot quicker. So my parts finally came in, my main shaft assembly is put together, and I'm going to put my countershaft assembly together, and then that way I'm just ready to put everything back in the case. So I did have to replace the bearings that were in my countershaft assembly, so I'm gonna have to push those new bearings back into the countershaft gear cluster, and then I'll be able to put the second gear back on the gear cluster and all that fun stuff. So for the first gear end of the gear cluster, your bearing is supposed to be pushed in 0.130 of an inch, and on the fourth gear end of the gear cluster, your bearing needs to be pushed in 0.180 of an inch. I actually cut a chunk off of the end of one of my sockets to help me press that in there, because I don't have a very big press, so this is what I'm using. I'm just using like a sliver end of a socket to push those in there, and this is 0.20 of an inch. So it's just a little bit bigger or a little bit thicker than the depth needs to be for either bearing. I do have my digital micrometer too, so I will set the end of this too, just to double check that the bearing is pushed in to the appropriate depth. So I've got my countershaft cluster sitting in front of the heater right now, heating up, and then I've got my bearings inside of the deep freeze, and hopefully they're a lot easier to put back in with those bearings being frozen and my gear cluster being too hot to touch. But it's not too hot. You don't don't want to heat it up too much because you don't want to take the temper out of your gears. That's important. So I'm pretty much set up to do this job now, and I hope you all wish me luck, because if it doesn't go well, it won't be in this video. I'm gonna try to do this as quickly as I can. And you only want to press from the lettered side of the bearing. Okay, and there's like no way to get this perfect without a tool. It's almost perfect. That actually went in there pretty easily. That was like panicking. I was panicking there though. Right, number 2. And this side, the 4th gear side, has to be 0.180. Get in there straight, please. Yeah, this one was a tricky one to get out. What a pain in the butt. That went in there perfect. Well, shoot! That went way easier than the first one. Well, there you are. That did it. Yes, it did. Well, pressing those bearings in actually went a whole lot smoother than I anticipated. It was pretty good, and they're both pretty perfect. So I can just put the rest of the countershaft back together now, and then, yeah, and then I'm ready to start putting the transmission back together. Woohoo! That feels good, because it's been like a long time coming. Ideally, I would have liked to have these videos come out like back to back to back, but we don't live in an ideal world. So we just gotta work with what we got and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes next time. Okay, so I've got my countershaft cluster here, and then I've got my 2nd gear, and then I've got my shifter dog here. Here's my spacer, my little snap ring, and my 1st gear. And I actually just have everything just stacked up, just as though it just came off of here and was flipped over. I've got my 2nd gear bushing and my 1st gear bushing, and these are not cheap bushings. These are Jim's bushings, and they are both just about like 50 bucks a piece. I think the 2nd gear was 50 bucks. And then the 1st gear bushing was around 40 bucks Canadian. So not cheap parts there. All right, I'm gonna be putting an assembly lube on everything just to help it all slide together a little bit easier. Let's put a little dab in here. I don't know, I've seen people use grease. I feel like grease is pretty thick. This is all gonna be in oil anyways, but this is just kind of just to help lubricate it and just keep things, you know, just nice and whatever until we actually fill it with oil. And I'm not putting a whole ton on because you don't need a whole ton. I find it easier to put the bushing on the shaft first and then put the gear on the bushing. It just helps to keep the bushing straight. And we'll put some more assembly lube. This stuff will be spinning on itself, so it is not a bad idea to have it good and greased up. Should be nice and greasy enough. Oily, pardon me. Not greasy, it's oily. You just want to make sure this goes on straight, because if you're out of whack even the tiniest amount, it is going to be a pain in the butt to get on there, because it is a tight fit. Make sure it's in there all the way. Oh yeah, it's definitely in there all the way. Okay, I've got a spacer now, and that actually just sits in these slots here on the countershaft cluster. There's a couple little tabs on the spacer. There's a good amount of oil in there already, so I'm not gonna worry about greasing that up. Okay, and we got that in there, and then we've got like our little, this is like a spring clip. It's like a spring clip. So that's a little tricky to get off, and probably almost equally as tricky to get on. You just want to make sure you don't manipulate it any more than you need to, because you don't really want to stretch it out too much. Okay, I'm just going to use a flathead screwdriver to just help me work this onto the shaft. All right, we're back. I just had to get you guys a little bit of a better view on this camera here, so hopefully it's a better view. And I'm just working this spring washer back down onto my countershaft cluster, and it does, there's a little groove at the bottom here. You probably just saw it snap into there. Just want to go all the way around, make sure it's in there all the way around, and that feels much better than it felt before. All right, so now my shifter dog, and this one is a non-directional. So it doesn't matter which way you put it on. Like if it's worn down on one end, the end that was like running before, you can always flip it over and have it run the other way. And then you have some sharp edges on your gears. I am gonna put just a little bit of assembly lube on these guys here, just because it's gonna be sitting dry for a little while yet. Make sure it's all greasy. That's good. And then we've got this thrust washer here too. I'm gonna also grease that up a little bit. Throw that on there. All right, and then I got my first gear, which I need a bushing for. And this bushing actually has got a bevel on one end. The manual does not say anything about a bevel, so I'm going to put the flat end of the bushing against the thrust washer there, because to me that is what makes sense, because then it'll help the gear to slide onto this beveled end. Same thing with the second gear, just put the bushing on the cluster. I find that to be much easier than trying to get the bushing into the gear straight. All right, first gear, pop that on. There we go. And then my thrust washer that will be taking up the end play or making up the end play will sit on this side of the countershaft, and then this side just has like a little washer that goes in there, or a spacer, whatever you want to call it. That just sits in there just like that. All right, so that's the countershaft cluster all ready to go, and now we can put the main shaft in the case. Now with my countershaft all assembled, I'm ready to put my main shaft in the case, and it's pretty straightforward. So you actually want to start by first putting in your fourth gear into the bearing, and I'm gonna just give that a good coat of grease actually, because that is going into a bearing. So I'm gonna just give that a good coat of grease. So I'll just give a good coating of grease right where the bearings are gonna ride on my fourth gear here. And I've already give a good coating of grease to the bearing itself. Some earlier models, they have loose needle bearings that you have to actually place on the fourth gear before you slide it in, but mine's a later model, so it's actually got needle bearings in a cage, which makes it a lot easier. You don't have to worry about losing any of those little rollers. All right, so that just slides in just like that. So then you kind of want to just like take your third gear, pop it in there for now. You can just pop it in there for now. I'm going to grease up my washer that goes on my third gear there. I will just place that down there. Get that right in my third gear. I'm going to give a good layer inside my third gear here. Alright, so just give a good layer into my third gear there. And now, what you want to do, so you kind of want to just pop your main shaft through just enough that you can get your third gear started on there. So you got your third gear on there with the washer. Alright, and then you want to put your lock ring or clip on there, which is going to be real tricky. And then you've got your shifter dog, and your shifter dog is marked high for the fourth gear side. It only goes on one way. So you want to make sure you put that on the right way. Okay, now that you got everything in there, you can just kind of rest that into your fourth gear there. And then you're gonna slide your third gear over, pop that up onto there, slide that over. You wanna slide your third gear washer over, which has got a couple little tabs on it so that it'll sit between the grooves on the shaft. Right, you wanna try to slide it straight. And now you got this lock ring here that you want to slide over top of here, and it's going to sit in a groove just in front of that washer there. That's your third gear lock washer. So you probably cannot see the groove on camera, but it is just down right tight up against your third gear washer there. And I'm just going to try to work this on there. Alright, so I've got my lock ring started on the shaft, and I'm just going to use my shifter dog actually to push it on there the rest of the way, and that'll just help me to get it on there straight and even. Hopefully that snap ring just snapped right into the groove where it belongs, and it looks like it's in there all the way around, so that is good. All right, and now that we've got that all together, then we can just tap our main shaft right back into place. So we've got our ball bearing here, and it's actually just sitting in the ball bearing carrier here. So we're gonna wanna just tap the end of the main shaft with a plastic hammer and just tap that carrier in so that it's seated against the case. And I'm gonna put just a little bit of assembly lube on there just to help it slide on there a little bit. All right, now I can just tap that in with my plastic hammer. So it is seated. There you go. And it's, as you can see, it's seated right up against the case there. All of that assembly lube I put on, pretty much all squished out around the edges, which I don't really want it in those threads. All right, so I cleaned out my threads with some brake cleaner. I've just let them dry, and I'm just gonna finish putting together the parts for my main shaft. So this is my bearing retainer plate. With that, you just wanna make sure that it's positioned correctly. You got a bit of a flat on the edge of it there, so you wanna put this in there. And then you got your holes lined up for your screws. And I also cleaned all of my screws because those were a little bit oily from before. And I just had to replace one of them because one of them was all rounded out. And unfortunately, I don't have any flathead ones of these. I only have a couple star-shaped ones. So yeah, that's okay. So I'm just giving each of these just a little drop of blue Loctite. Just a little bit like that. Don't want to forget your oil deflector thingy. Make sure that that is positioned properly on there. I want to go quickly once you start putting these in there. And these can be done up to 6 to 9 foot-pounds. There we go. Okay. All right, so I got my spring now, goes in. My shifter clutch. So on the main shaft there, I've got my little key that you don't want to forget. Just pop that right on the main shaft there. And you just want to try to line that up as best you can. And there you go. There we go. So I was getting tired and grumpy last night and nothing was going my way because that's how it goes when I'm tired and grumpy. So I saved the rest of the job for today and I'm gonna finish it up and finally have this transmission done. So I'm gonna put my countershaft in and then I will continue to assemble everything else on like the outer edges of the transmission case. Alright, so I just got my transmission case laying on its side like this because it's a lot easier to put the countershaft in that way. And then I can just slide the whole assembly in there and I'll put my thrust washer in after I actually have my countershaft holding the cluster. So just slide that into place. Just grease these bearings up a little bit before I get too ahead of myself. Now we can put it all together. Okay. Grease this up nice and good because I do not want to wreck that O-ring. No siree, Bob. Whoever came up with that anyway? Like, who is Bob? You know, like everyone says it. Bob's your uncle. No siree, Bob. Who is Bob? And how did he get that reputation? Slide this in. There you go. There we go. So I've got it pushed all the way through, as you can see there, but I'm gonna have to push it back a bit just to get my thrust washer in there, but I'm gonna do that while the transmission's standing up. Well guys, it's a few days later and the 100 thou thrust washer that I was trying to use was actually too thick and it hardly even fit in with the countershaft cluster. So there would have definitely been zero end play if I were to use that, if I could have even got it in, which I couldn't have. And I did not have any other thrust washers, so I had to go and track down some thrust washers. I actually bought a pack of 7 and there should be, well, there is the size that I'm gonna need in there. So I finally believe that I have absolutely everything that I need to finish this job, and I'm going to finish it today. So we're just going to continue from where I left off and put the proper size thrust washer in with the countershaft cluster. This job is getting finished today, whether it likes it or not. Okay, so continuing on where I left off, I've got my 90 thou thrust washer that I'm going to use here on the countershaft cluster. This should be the proper size now. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is put some grease on the end of here. Also put some grease on here, on the side that is going to be against the case. Just going to just glue that to there. Turn this around. Just get in there, you. Don't be such a pain in the butt. Okay. Countershaft in. Line up. Won't you fall down, you? Is that through? Yes. Okay, countershaft is finally in. All right, I got a couple feeler gauges in here. I'm using 2 because just putting 1 in there just kind of torques the washer over kind of to one side like that, so I don't feel like it really gives you an accurate reading. So what I found fit the best was my 0.008 feeler gauges. So between 7 thou and 12 thou is what's the tolerance, and that's 8 thou, so it's pretty good. I'm glad, because I really did not want to have to take that out of there again, because that was a pain in the butt getting it in. So I'm going to torque everything down now that I've got that all set up, and I can just finish putting this all back together. Right, so my locking plate, and you want to make sure that your locking plate goes up against the flat of the bearing plate here, and then I've got my locking washer and my nut. And this is supposed to be torqued from 56 to 65 foot-pounds, somewhere in there. I'm gonna go to 60. There we go. And actually, guys, this is where a transmission stand really comes in handy, because you can actually just clamp it down, and it really helps for torquing stuff up. So I'm just gonna bend one of these lock tabs up on the washer here, and I actually like to use channel locks for that, and hard to get to places like this. There we go. There we go. That's done. Countershaft is in, and it is done. Man, does that ever feel good. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to press in my 4th gear seal, my main shaft seal, and I don't actually have a press that I can fit my entire transmission case in, so I'm gonna kind of just use a little bit of like a jimmy rig kind of setup, and hopefully it works out. I gotta put my sleeve into my oil seal first of all. I'm just gonna put a little coat of grease on my seal. Just spread that around. I'm gonna get it on this side of the lip and put a little bit on here too. And this is notched out here for the little L key that would go in. So I'll just start it on there just so that I don't wreck the seal. Just carefully. Okay, I'm also going to use some of this Aviation Tech gasket maker on the outside of the seal. You don't want to put too much on because you don't want that getting in everywhere. So the manual does not say anything about a quart gasket for this year transmission. So I will not be putting a quart gasket in. And yeah, there are oil passages down there, so I'm assuming you don't want to block those off. I'm going to place this in here. And that kind of helps hold it straight also. And then I've got this piece of like pipe. All right, so hopefully I can hold everything still. Put my washer on there. Get this nut on there. It's a reverse thread. And then just tighten it all up. You want to have it locked into 2 gears to keep it from spinning. Now you can just try to push that seal in 1 1/8 wrench. And let's go. And you just want to go flush with the case. That feels like it's all the way. There we go, that's in there. Perfect, beautiful. Wipe off this extra gasket. All right, so next seal to go on is this little guy. Okay, this is gonna look pretty funny, but this is the only thing I could find that was the right size and length to do this with. And yeah, it's just like a plumbing tee, a copper tee. So this should work, I think. I'm gonna make sure to grease my seal up. Nice and greasy, nice and greasy. And I'll put a little grease on here too, just cause. I'll just slide that on. All right, I just had to cut the end of my tee off because it was a little bit too long to fit on here, and now it is the right length. So I'll just do the same exact method that I did before. Should not have to push this very hard to get that to go in there. There we go. That was pretty easy. Oh, that's done. Okay guys, so I'm all set up here and I'm just checking my clearances on my shifter clutches. I've already checked them off camera because I didn't want to be doing a bunch of fiddling around on camera. So I know what I've got to do already, but I'm just going to show you guys what I did while you were not watching. So I just checked the clearances on my first and second gear shifter clutch and my third and fourth gear shifter clutch. And my first and second gear shifter clutch is pretty much centered already. There's just a 5 thou difference from either side. And you just want to make sure when you're checking these that if you've got a taper on your gear like that, the way that I do, is that you've got an overlap on your shifter clutch here, because you want to make sure that you're checking that at the point where they're going to be the closest together. So how I'm doing this is I'm just making sure that my shifter clutch is touching my shifter fork, and just touching it, but not pushing so hard against it that it's going to be torquing my shifter fork like sideways. Just to be touching it like that. And then I'm fitting my feeler gauges right in here. And then the same thing on the other side is I'm just pushing my shifter clutch over just so that it's touching the shifter fork, and I'm fitting my feeler gauges in on this side. And I just want to feel a little bit of a resistance without actually having to jam my feeler gauges in there so hard that it's going to be pushing anything over super tight, because as soon as you start pushing stuff over super tight, you're not going to have a proper reading on your feeler gauges. And these are only out by about 5 thou of a difference, so I'm going to leave them at that. That's pretty much as close as you can get them with the shims that are available anyway. So it's pretty easy to get in there on the first and second gear shifter clutch because you got quite a bit of room. But on the third and fourth gear back here, it's pretty tricky with this tool in the way. So I was actually just using my feeler gauges like this because I couldn't actually get my fingers in around everything here. So I've checked all of this already, so I already know what it's at. And I've actually got quite a bit of a difference between my third and fourth gear, and I'm not going to try to demonstrate that for you guys right now because it's super tricky just even getting my feeler gauges in here, and I wouldn't be able to do it in view of the camera anyways with the way that I'd have to have the transmission turned. So what I'm going to have to do here now is I'm going to take my tool off. I'm going to have to put an extra shim in here on the third gear side of the shifter fork, so there's enough of a difference that I can put a 15 thou shim in here, and then I will be about 6 thou difference from side to side, which is as close I'm going to get with the shims that I've got right now. I'm going to take this apart and I'm going to see if maybe I can swap some of these around. And before I measure my shifter fork clearances on my third and fourth gear, I made sure that I was actually torqued down properly with my sprocket nut. So I've got that down to the proper torque specs. I've actually got a smaller sprocket on here too. So normally if it were the bigger size sprocket, you would have to do all this before you actually have your sprocket on permanently, which my sprocket's a little bit smaller than it used to be. So I actually can do all of this. I can get my shifter fork shaft out with the sprocket on. So I'm going to take off this old nut and washer, and I'm going to actually just properly mount my super nut, and then I'm going to continue on taking apart my shifter forks and everything and putting the shim in there. So I'm just going to slide this out. All right guys, so I'm going to put my sprocket on right now, and I want to just show you you guys my setup here before I get started. So I'm actually set up here with a homemade tool that my dad made probably before I was born actually. And what it is just a piece of bar stock with a piece of heavy chain on it. And this is just gonna help hold my sprocket in place while I do that up. That's a pretty heavy torque on there. The manual calls for 140 to 150 foot-pounds on here. And really important before you do everything up here, you don't want to forget to put this little L key in. So this little L key's got like a longer end and a shorter end. I'm gonna put it so that the shorter end is actually sitting on the main gear while the longer end is up in the spacer there, and the sprocket's gonna sit up against that, so that'll help hold everything in place there. And then the sprocket goes on with the flat facing the outside, and you don't need to Loctite this nut, but I am gonna put a little bit of anti-seize on mine because you also don't want it rusting to the fourth gear there. And I've already greased my seal. Put a little bit of grease on my main shaft just to help everything slide without wrecking the seal. And this is a reverse thread too on here. Having a transmission stand for this job is super helpful too because you can clamp everything down nice and secure while you do this all up. Now I'm going to just adjust my tool in the vise a little bit. So I'm just gonna move this over just slightly and then do it up super tight. Super duper tight. There we go. All right, so I've got my tool all adjusted in the vise, and I've actually got a socket in here to space the tool out so that it doesn't end up hitting the case at all. I don't want all that torque being pushed up against this aluminum casting. And I just have my chain wrapped around. I kind of like to wrap it just so it starts to overlap. And now I'm ready to just start torquing this down. And remember, this is a reverse thread. There we go. Okay. And we can just remove all of this. Ouch. Whoops. Okay, I don't know what it is with this transmission job, guys, but I swear it is the transmission from hell. Literally everything I've done on this thing has taken way longer than it should. There's been like just parts that I've ended up needing that have just taken forever to show up. And then every time I turn around, one of my cameras has either died or just randomly stopped recording for no reason at all. And yeah, it's just, I don't even know what it is, guys, but I'm getting closer to done. I'm finally ready just to do my shims on my shifter fork, and that means that I can put my shifter forks in, and once my shifter forks are in, I can put the top on the transmission, and then, oh my gosh, this thing is closed up forever. Okay. I've got my shifter fork clamped in my vise here with my aluminum jaws so that I don't damage anything. So I'm going to be taking that off, but I first got to get my locking tab out of the way. Let's see if we can make it get off like this. Ah, that's the ticket. There we go. It's a little worn. That's just because of how out of whack this whole thing was. But you know what? It's not getting replaced. I can tell you that much. Put that there for a second. Now I do want to check these to see what thickness they are. I think these are probably the same thickness as the ones I have, but I feel like this might be thinner. No, it's a 14. It's a 14 thou. Put that on there. My lock washer now. Okay, and it's got like a little tab on there, little tang, and that actually just fits in the slot. It's pretty straightforward, guys. This is definitely not like a tutorial video. Okay, so shifter fork next. Put that on there, and my locking washer. It's got a little tab on it. Get in there. Guys, I really hope that you guys are finding this entertaining because it is not informative. Okay, this little nut is supposed to be 25 foot-pounds. Right, 25 foot-pounds on this little puppy. There we go. Bend up my little tab. There we go. So now I'm good to put my shifter shaft in, shifter fork shaft, and I'm just gonna slide this in. I'm not gonna put the seal on yet because I just wanna visually check my alignment on that shifter clutch after adding that shim in there. Got my tool here still set to the proper setting. Okay, now I'll turn this around for you guys to see. Whoopsie. Well, you're probably not going to be able to see that shifter clutch very well in there because the tool's in the way, but I'm just moving it over from side to side till it touches the shifter fork, as I explained before. And I'm just going to visually look and see that it looks centered. So I'm going to turn this back around for myself to see. Alright, so I managed to get my shifter fork shaft in place and everything looks good. I also did actually remeasure the clearance on my shifter clutch between my third and fourth gear also, just for peace of mind, and it does measure out to what my calculations said it would, which is about a 6 thou difference, and that is good. That's as close as we're gonna get with the shims that I've got. So I'm gonna finish working on my kicker cover side of things. I still need to torque down this nut here, but I also need to replace some studs because this is an old 4-speed transmission that's been through the ringer, and nothing on it is going to be as simple as just slapping it together. Alright, so this stud's one that I've already replaced with a piece of 5/16 fine thread ready rod that's just going into one of the steel sleeves that I made with my dad, and I've got to make 2 more of those studs for these holes, and I've also got to mount this old stud into this original thread here. So the easiest way, or well, probably like the only way to do that without wrecking your threads, is just with a couple nuts. So I've got a couple fine thread nuts here. I'm going to put this one on, and then this nut I'm just going to tighten these 2 nuts against each other, and that's going to be what I'm going to use to actually torque this thing down into the thread. And I've already cleaned this hole out with brake cleaner, and I chased the threads a little bit with a tap just to make sure that they were clean, and then cleaned it out with brake cleaner. And I'm just using Loctite because I don't want these coming out. And then you just do these, and then you use your outside nut to tighten everything down. Not too tight because it's going into aluminum, but tight. Okay, I'm gonna make this stud now. To make this, I'm just gonna thread this in here. Alright, so this stud I want to make the same length as these studs here. These studs stick out about 1 inch from the case, and these 3 studs in the front here are 1 1/8 inches. And the reason how come these ones are a little bit longer is because in some models of Harleys, these studs would have also been used for mounting the foot peg. So these ones are a little bit longer, and these ones here got 1 inch of thread out of the case. So this one is what I'm going to make to match. Nice new stud there. We'll just make 1 more and then I'll start putting this thing back together. Alright, this Loctite's dried up overnight, so I'm gonna put my kicker cover back on. Yes, and then the shifter cover back on. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be done this. I don't know if you can tell from my outfit, but I did not want to come out here today. And yeah, I'm just kind of dressed like a little bit of a slob, so just don't even pay attention to that. We're just here to put a few nuts and bolts on, and then we are done. This transmission, I cannot believe it. I felt like I was gonna be building this thing forever. Okay, so I just need to lock this thing down here. So that's 50 to 60 foot-pounds on that little nut there. There we go. I'm just so excited to be done this job. So excited. Move on to the next part. Push that sucker through. All right, kicker cover next. I've got my gasket and I've actually just sprayed a good, nice thin layer of copper coat on there. All right, I'm gonna make sure my dowel pin on my kicker gear is kind of at the top. Then I don't have to fight my spring on my starter clutch as much. And I got a bunch of new nuts and washers for this. I'm doing these up to 15 foot-pounds, and that's 180 inch-pounds. There we go. Kicker cover done. To the side there. All right. Make sure that these are out of their gears. Make sure my ratchet cover is in neutral. My gasket, I've also got some copper coat on this gasket. And pop that on there. Okay, so on the right side of the transmission, you got your dowel pin, and then you also have a breather bolt that goes in. So the breather bolt goes into the hole that is closest to the dowel pin, which is this one here. So it's important to make sure that that breather bolt goes back into the proper hole. So now I'll pop my cover on. Pop that onto the dowel pins. And these screws that are for the cover, for this size screw, it would be 6 foot-pounds, which is 72 inch-pounds. Every one of them gets a little drop of blue Loctite. I always Loctite all of my bolts before I start doing any of them up. Before I even put them in, I give them all a little bit of Loctite first, and that makes it quick. And very last thing is replacing that washer that I did not have at the time of doing this cover. So that is what I will do. Well, you guys, there it is. Here it is. Oh, the long-awaited end to this transmission video. Look at that. My very first transmission rebuild. Doesn't it look good? Ouch, this sprocket's digging into my hand. Feels so good to be done this thing, like it's crazy. I knew I'd have to wait for parts for like a week or two for sure, but I honestly thought that it would be a really quick process altogether, but that's the way it goes when you're doing things for the first time. Next time, I'll order a rebuild kit, and then I have everything I need, and I have extras of whatever I don't need. The only thing that I haven't done yet is wind this spring now that I'm looking at it, which we want to do because or else it's not really done, is it? And now it's over. For this transmission, and not for me. I'm going upstairs to have some pizza and wine. I cannot wait. I'm so excited for wine and pizza and just sitting on the couch reading your guys' comments. That is what my evening's gonna look like. I hope you guys are all having a cozy evening wherever you are. It's Sunday for me right now. So anyway, if you didn't find it helpful, I hope you at least found it entertaining, and if you like what you see, or if you just like me, or even if you don't like me but you like my bikes, then like this video, comment, subscribe, share, and do all those things you guys do, and read the description too if you want to know how you can get pictures of your bike in one of my episodes. And don't forget to go and check out my Shovel Fest video 2024 to see what that's gonna be all about. Go check out my Shovel Fest videos, guys. Shovel Fest is awesome. And like always, my lovely YouTube people, I will catch y'all on the flip side. Peace. Oh, that's on there. Well, that's as far as it goes. Wait, that can't be as far as it goes. It's not possible for that to be as far as it goes. Oh, frick. Shifter fork. What am I doing, man? Oh my gosh. Don't say that. So the frustration, yes. Okay. The proper size countershaft. I'm so done with it. Man. And of course, my hands are all greasy now. I just heard someone go by on a bike. I'm definitely not a professional. No, you're not working? Of course not. Man, what is the deal around here anyway? Okay, I'm ready to do this job. I hope all of you cameras are ready to do this job. Are you recording? No, you're not. See what I mean? So, back to plan A. I feel like it's probably plan A, and I've already gone through the alphabet twice. So, and I'm pretty tired, so I apologize for any